Welcome to the Birds in the Classroom breakout session. My name is Rachel Hall, and I am the Program Assistant for 4-H and Youth Development in Comal County. I'm happy to welcome Dr. Maureen Frank to our training and specifically this session. Dr. Frank is an Assistant Professor and Extension Wildlife Specialist based in Uvalde, Texas. Birds in the Classroom is a program aimed at exactly what the title states, Birds in the Classroom. The training allows educators the opportunity to learn more about birds and how to bring birding into the classroom. Today will be a brief overview of a few of the basics. If you are interested in learning more or implementing this program in your classroom, please let me know. I would be happy to help get something started in your classroom. Today, we will be going over 4 different aspects to birds in the classroom. This video in particular will focus on introduction to bird identification. Other videos will feature curricula and apps, citizen science, and Leopold's tools. First, we will start with an introduction to bird identification and the tools you can use for identification. S4B is an equation created by Dr. Glasscock with the Welder Wildlife Foundation to use in the field to identify birds. The 4 S's are sight, sound, season, and surroundings, followed by the B, behavior. Sight. It is important to know your silhouettes and then to compare them to birds you already know. So we know the bird on the right is a cardinal. You can look at the shape of its head, the bill, the eyes, the shape of the tail, the shape of the wings, and the color of the bird. Lots of people are familiar with a cardinal, so it is a good bird to start with. Here's another example of different birds that you can use. The buff-bellied hummingbird in the top right corner looks much different than the roseate spoonbill with the long spatulate bill, large wingspan, and long legs. All are different characteristics you can use to make observations and notes to use later to identify those birds. We also have the northern bobwhite in the bottom middle picture, which compared to the other birds, you can describe it much differently. It's much more rounded. It has different color on its head, different marks. Its bill is much shorter compared to the roseate spoonbill and the buff-bellied hummingbird. So you can use all those characteristics to observe these different birds so you can identify them later. Tail shape is another important characteristic to consider. These 2 species are often mixed up because they both fly on thermals and look similar from a distance. The common black hawk has a more squared, fanned-out tail, while the bird on the right is a vulture species, which has a more rounded, tucked-in tail. Wing shape is also a common characteristic to use to help identify bird species. Here's a couple of different birds with very vibrant colored wings. As you can see, this painted bunting in the bottom middle picture has a different coloring than the other birds in the picture. Color is another good example of something that is abundant in the bird world. Think about how you would describe these different birds without saying they are all yellow. The bottom bird has a darker gray colored wing, while the bird on the bottom right-hand side appears to have a black crown. And on the top right, we have a bird that has a gray colored head. So it's important to look at the differences, even though from first glance, you would probably identify them as all yellow birds. Here are examples of some field marks you can use when you're out in the field. Take note of some things that you can see for later. Let's start off looking if you can see the crown of the bird. That's a really good identifiable mark. The eyeline is another helpful place to look on a bird if you can get that close. The mustache, especially on sparrows, which will have different malar stripes, is a good identifier. The breast and the rump are also good to look at, along with the crest. This bird right here is a Proloxia bird, which looks very similar to a cardinal, but if you look at its beak and its coloring, you can identify that it has some different characteristics compared to a cardinal that you might be familiar with. Titmice also have pronounced crests, so that's something that's similar to a cardinal, but is going to be a different bird altogether. Here's some more field marks to look at. Oh, going back, let's look at our duck wings. So these two wings in the picture are duck wings. Wings are used for duck identification. On the leading edge, so the wing lining, which is similar to an armpit, is a really good indicator of the different types of ducks you might identify. This top picture has black lines along the primaries, whereas the secondaries do not. So over here, people like to identify ducks based on the speculum, so the color that they have on those feathers. Both hens and drakes will have the speculum, and bright iridescent speculum feathers are primarily identified in flight. So this is an up-close view of the head area of a bird. I mentioned the mallard stripe and the eye ring. So the mallard stripe is going to be coming down from the beak, and then the eye ring is going to be around the eye, pronounced in this picture, both of those. The throat is another good place to look as well. This is just a list of different field marks and terminology you can use and understand. When you're out observing birds, you can make notes that will help you identify them later on. Here's a diagram of the feather tract. So P1 is going to be the start of the primary. So P1 out is going to be the primaries. Most birds are going to have 9 or 10 depending on the species. Secondaries count from the middle toward the body. So here we have S1 through S9. The last 3, 7, 8, and 9 are called, the last 3, so 7, 8, and 9 are called tertial feathers, but are also considered secondary feathers. They might be a different color from those between different birds, but those are the ones you will probably observe when the wing is going to be tucked in on the bird. The primary coverts will cover the primary feathers. The greater coverts, secondary coverts cover the secondary feathers. Lots of wing bars and species will occur in the greater covert area, which is helpful to look for. On our tail feathers are called rectrices, and birds typically have 12. Another good spot to look for coloration is in the upper tail coverts. The rump and the scapula and the nape and the breast are also good areas to identify. This is a more realistic picture of an anhinga bird that you can use. If I saw this out in the field, I would notice the ridges along the rectrices. The primaries are black, the secondaries are black, whereas the tertials have some white markings on them. The greater coverts and the primary coverts are primarily white, which are all important observations to write down. Bill shape, very sharp, kind of long bill, longer neck, short stubby feet. They could potentially be webbed. So those are some other characteristics that I would focus on writing down if I did not know what kind of bird this was in the field. All right, we will now talk about specific bird groups. Shorebirds and wading birds are going to be our first birds that we'll talk about. Shorebirds and wading birds have aquatic habitats, so they'll live in lakes, rivers, ponds, oceans, and wetlands. Their diet depends vastly on the species, but most of these birds are going to eat crustaceans, seeds, macroinvertebrates, and then small invertebrates, kind of like fish. Characteristics of these birds: they have long necks, they have long legs, they normally have long, thin, unwebbed toes and feet. They use these long necks to keep their heads from being submerged underwater. They also use their long bills for that. Long legs, you'll always be able to see those, and then those unwebbed toes. They also have a variety of bill types depending on the bird itself. Here's some examples of shorebirds and wading birds. On the top left, we have an American coot. If you can look closely, you can see the lobes on the toes, which is used for walking on lily pads or dense vegetation. Bottom middle, we have our black-necked stilts. They have very long legs. They have a long bill, very similar to the spoonbill in the top right corner. Top middle, we have a great blue heron, and you can see its foot out of the water, so you can identify those really long toes. And then it has a spear bill, which, as you can see in this picture, it speared the fish with its bill. Finally, bottom left and bottom right, we have our snowy egret and sandhill cranes. Both of those can be found in wetlands and open grasslands foraging, so they won't necessarily always be found primarily near the water. They can be in other places as well, so keep that in mind. Ducks and geese are next. They are grouped together. They're found primarily around fresh and saltwater wetlands, although there are some ocean sea ducks that we might touch on a little bit later. Diet's going to consist of crustaceans and seeds, fish and macroinvertebrates, just like our shorebirds and wetland birds are. On our ducks, you'll notice just how many different types of bills that they have. Dabbling and puddle ducks are on top in that top picture. You can kind of tell what type of duck they are based on their buoyancy. So our dabbling ducks, puddle ducks, are going to sit much higher in the water than diving ducks for the most part. They'll have shorter legs, webbed feet, that speculum on their secondary feathers, which you can use to identify them in flight. We also have geese. Geese are going to have larger bodies, longer necks than ducks, webbed feet. You can see this is just a larger bird in general. Here are some more examples of some species that we have of ducks and geese. You can see the geese in the bottom middle picture are going to be just a little bit bigger than our duck species are. You can see the webbed feet, the speculum. So that top middle picture is a northern shoveler. You can see the green speculum along with the white color on the greater coverts of their feathers. And you can just see how colorful those are on those different types of birds. Birds of prey are next. Surroundings, they live primarily in woodlands, open grasslands, and lakes. Their diet is carnivorous, so they'll eat small rodents, snakes, lizards, fish, other birds, and then they'll occasionally scavenge when the need arises. Some identifiable characteristics of birds of prey: they will always have hooked bills, they will always have long talons, and then you will often see them soaring along the thermals or perched watching for prey. So here's some examples of some of our birds of prey. Top right, we'll have our kestrel, which has stripes on its face. Top left is the crested caracara. Bottom left is going to be a barn owl. So just a bunch of different types of birds within this subgroup. But you can see they all have the hooked bill and then the long talons. Next, we have our passerines. These are most likely going to be the birds you see at the feeder you have at your house. Surroundings, they live in woodlands, grasslands, riparian areas. They eat insects, seeds, fruits. Some species are carnivorous, but most of them are going to feed primarily on those three things. Identifiable characteristics. What sets these types of birds apart is that they're anisodactyl, which means they have 3 digits facing forward and 1 facing back. And so this allows them to roost in trees, which is really important for these types of birds. They're going to be smaller to medium-sized birds. They're often very brightly colored, and they have a variety of bill shapes and sizes. Sound is another one of our accurate methods of identification. It's going to be a lot more difficult to identify a bird based on sound from the beginning of your birding experience. Species that look similar often have different sounds that they make. So what we suggest people do is start by learning the most common birds in your area. So in our area, cardinals are very common. So that would be where I started. And I already know what a cardinal sounds like, but look up those cardinal songs online. And you can listen to their recorded songs and kind of get a feel for what they sound like in different situations. But again, there's no substitute for spending time outside in the field, observing these birds and matching vocalizations to what they're doing. So here I have two different birds, the Nashville warbler and the orange-crowned warbler. Below you can see the song described in word, but we're gonna listen to that. Oh, sorry. And then let's listen to the orange-crowned warbler. So you can see they sound very different. Next, we're gonna look at our spectrograms. And this is just taking the song and putting it on paper. So you can see exactly what that song sounds like and looks like. So let's listen to those again. So that was our Nashville warbler. Let's listen to our orange-crowned warbler. So they look different and they sound different, even though the birds themselves might look similar to each other. Season is another good characteristic. If you have a chance, learn the general seasons for common birds in your area. It's a good idea to learn migration patterns, especially if you live in a place where birds migrate to or from or via. Identifying if they're going to be more popular in the winter versus the summer. You can Google all of this information and find it for the specific bird species that you're interested in learning more about. Surroundings, location, again, is very important. Think about what birds do we expect in this location, and then what birds do we not expect in our location. So that on the right is an Eider's Arctic sea duck. We will hopefully never see this bird in Comal County. If we do, we've got a problem. So thinking about what birds will never be in Texas or in our county is important, and you can cut down the number of possible birds that you could observe and identify based on where they should be at a certain time of the year. Habitat is another big one. There's 4 primary things that birds are looking for when they live somewhere. So birds need access to food, they need access to water, they need access to shelter, and then they need space. Okay, let me go a little bit more in depth about this. Food, so it's going to depend on availability for the birds as far as what they have available to eat and where that is going to be located. Water, there's a couple of different options for water. They have drinking and physiological needs, so drinking and then bathing. There's a couple of different options water-wise. So they have free water, which is from rain and in rivers. There's preformed water, which is available in their food. Metabolic water, which means that they don't have to drink as much. Shelter, birds are going to need thermal regulation, which is how they regulate their temperature. Birds will nest, and so it depends whether they are a species that nest on the ground or are arboreal nesters. And then also roosting, so where these birds go at night, is important to consider for the habitat of the birds that you're trying to attract or the birds you're trying to identify. Predator avoidance is another big issue, whether they have aerial predators, so birds of prey, or terrestrial predators such as cats. Space. So space is the consideration of if birds have enough food, water, and shelter in one area to survive with others. Interspecies relationships is brought into this discussion of space. You consider predaceous circumstances in the area, mating opportunities, competition, migration. All those things are considered when you look at space for a habitat. Behavior. It's a good thing to maybe learn or know a little bit about where and how a bird spends its time. So birds of prey spend their time sitting perched up high looking for prey, whereas our songbirds might be roosted in trees or closer to the ground, spending time looking for food and things like that. Looking into what a bird's flight pattern look like is another idea. And then also if a bird is solitary or if it is in a flock. And so identifying these behaviors can help you identify the different species. Here's some pictures of flight patterns in birds, and then above what wingspan looks like for different types of birds. Again, with the behavior, looking at posture, how their wing beat looks, and then how it sounds, how they spend time on the ground. So that type of movement, flight pattern's a big deal. Feeding style, in ducks, identifying if it's a dabbling duck, so it just eats off the top of the water versus if it's a diving duck. And then flocking is another thing to consider. With that, we will end this video on identification of birds. We hope you enjoyed this session and that you will tune into our other videos to learn about the other aspects of birds in the classroom. Thank you.